law. Periodically, year in and year out, articles appear in magazines and newspapers attacking nepotism. The word nepotism has an insidious sound. It suggests criminality and vice, and it carries an unpleasant connotation. Actually, the original meaning of nepotism was favoritism to nephews in hiring, and the word has come to mean favoritism to any relative in hiring, especially in civil government. The subject of nepotism is rarely considered fairly or unemotionally. A typical treatment is Jack Anderson's "let's kick relatives off congressional payrolls" in Parade. Anderson cites a variety of congressional cases: a congressman whose wife is his secretary, others who hire uncles, brothers, cousins, and in one case, even a mother-in-law. Nepotism, Anderson tells us sadly, is a bipartisan practice, and he concludes, quote, "Public confidence in Congress is so low that the legislators should wipe out even the suspicion of wrongdoing. The time has come to outlaw nepotism." End quote. Anderson's article is written with a note of strong moral indignation, and Anderson quite obviously believes himself to be championing the cause of reform. The question needs to be raised, however, very earnestly and urgently as to whether Anderson's moral perspective is not radically wrong. More than that, the whole question of nepotism needs to be reviewed. Is it really a morally questionable practice? Is there an offence? Is there a defence possible for nepotism on the highest possible moral grounds? Is it possible that the idea that nepotism represents an immoral practice is itself indicative of a radical moral decline? Anderson's report is morally wrong because, first of all, it makes no moral distinction between fraud and honest work. The case of a congressman's wife is cited who earned $20,288.46 a year without working. Her most urgent business with his congressional office had been a request for instructions in Spanish or how to play dominoes. This clearly is a case of fraud, and it should be treated as such. Money so received is morally to be regarded as theft. We can all agree that such a practice must be condemned, but it must also be insisted that to equate such fraud with the honest work of a relative is also morally wrong. The congressman or senator who hires a relative, son, daughter, or mother-in-law, and from his relative receives faithful and honest work, cannot be equated with a man who defrauds the government. To make this equation is a sign of moral delinquency. Second, Anderson's article never raises the all-important question: what's wrong with nepotism? Is there anything wrong with hiring a relative to work for you in government or in business if that relative gives good and faithful service? To understand the moral issues involved in nepotism, let us examine its history very briefly. The word nepotism was coined several centuries ago to describe the practice of various popes of hiring their nephews to fulfill important roles in the Vatican and in the Papal States. The practice gained a special prominence under Pope Nicholas III toward the close of the 13th century. It was also very severely criticised as part of the practice of Sixtus VI in the 15th century. The Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, was also notorious for his nepotism. The practice was finally outlawed by Popes Innocent XI and XII in the 17th century. There is no doubt that some of the scandals connected with some relatives gave both nepotism and the Church a bad name, but it seems hardly likely that Alexander VI would have been any better morally had he not practiced nepotism. Not all popes practiced nepotism for corrupt reasons. Most had important considerations in mind. They needed the confidential help of someone of unquestioned loyalty who would enable them to execute their plans of action without betrayal or hesitation. Only a relative could give this kind of loyalty, and hence the use of relatives. Where the plan of action was morally sound, there was no harm and much good in the use of trustworthy men. Where a program is morally unsound, it makes no difference who is used to execute it. The situation of congressmen and senators is very similar. They are exceedingly vulnerable to bad public relations, a bad press, infiltration by interests subversive of their own purposes and of their office, and the bribing of confidential secretaries and aides is a commonplace fact of business administration, and as well as fact of business, as well as in the administration of offices in the civil government. Under such circumstances, a man's most trustworthy associates are the members of his family. They have an honest vested interest in protecting him in the discharge of his duties. It is true that this may mean that 2, 3, or 4, or 5 salaries will go to a man and his relatives, but as long as it is work his relatives. But as long as it is for work honestly done, there is no moral wrong in this practice. It is often a necessary safeguard and security measure basic to a sound administration of office. Similarly, in the business world, many a man makes room in his office for relatives or for his sons, and why not? If his relatives fail to do their work properly, it is he who suffers for it, business-wise. Similarly, if a congressman's wife proves to be a poor secretary and offends the public, the congressman is the loser. But we have not touched on the basic moral issue as yet. Why this strange belief that the employment of a member of the family is morally wrong? In the medieval church, the criticism came in part from the monastic hostility to the family. It was assumed that a churchman should be dead to the world and to his family. In the modern world, there is an even more anti-family motive at work. Inheritance taxes, income taxes, property laws, and other legislation have worked to limit the independence and authority of the family. The family has less and less rights and less independence. Instead of assuming that a man's best helpers are the members of his family, it is assumed that there is some moral wrong in having family help. Articles such as Anderson's attack responsible men and classify them with men guilty of fraudulent practices simply because they rely on family help in sensitive positions. Family loyalty, one of the most basic supports any man can have, is in effect denied to men in public office. Such an attitude is morally indefensible. Moreover, it is basically hostile to biblical faith, which stresses the centrality of the family in every aspect of life. The Bible does not treat nepotism as a crime, but rather as a moral necessity. If nepotism is a crime and a moral wrong, then we are condemning God, who in some cases specifically required or commanded it. It was God who called an ordinance. It was God. It was God who called and ordained that Aaron, Moses' brother, should become Moses' closest associate. When Moses became the civil head of the Hebrew Commonwealth, Aaron, by God's ordination, became the religious head, the high priest, and Miriam, his sister, became a prophetess. As long as Aaron and Miriam fulfilled their duties, God blessed them. When they disobeyed and presumed on their relationship, they were punished. King David relied very extensively on his family, and especially his cousins, such as Joab, in the government of Israel, and virtually every monarch in the Bible relied on relatives without anything but God's blessing. As long as all moved in terms of God's law, The Bible is clearly favourable to the use of relatives in civil administration, and it is clearly not morally permissible for a Christian to condemn the legitimate and useful employment of relatives. Therefore, whenever and wherever nepotism is condemned, it is condemned on a moral principle which is not biblical and is, in fact, anti-biblical. The office of high priest in the time of Jesus Christ was passed around the family of Annas, the high priest, to his son Eleazar and his son-in-law Caiaphas. The biblical condemnation of these men is not because of their nepotism, but because of their unbelief. Two of the disciples, James and John, were cousins of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from start to finish, is strongly family-oriented. There is no wrong in their employment and much good. We face today an anti-biblical morality which is at war with biblical morality and therefore the family. It is called morally wrong to employ members of our family, but it is treated as somehow virtuous to trust our mortal enemies. Parents are told that it's wrong for them to assist their children in learning how to read, but they are urged to go into the slums and help other people's children. Other people's children. Other people's children. Parents are treated as moral lepers for being partial to their children above all others, and one prominent educator has called it an anti-democratic and aristocratic sentiment. Somehow, it is insinuated that it is morally wrong to be partial to your own family. All this anti-family talk and sentiment goes against the law of God as declared in the Bible and in the laws of being. These attacks on the family are part of a movement to replace a familistic order with another order, a status one, to replace personal relations with impersonal ones. We have abolished or are trying to abolish the strongly personal feelings that generate family loyalties. We are treating family associations in business administration or in civil government as somehow immoral, and by batteries of tests and requirements, we are depersonalizing offices and civil service. Supposedly, we are abolishing prejudice and discrimination. In actuality, we are. In actuality, we are first establishing prejudice legally against the family. Second, by depersonalizing offices and the civil service, we are not furthering love, but rather enmity. We abolish loyalty, and by abolishing loyalty, we diminish integrity and faithfulness. It is high time we abandon the idea that any set of tests, laws, or rules can give us a perfect social order or a perfect group of employees or civil service. Nothing is more productive of social chaos than the attempt to create a perfect system. Men are, by nature, sinners. They can be saved sinners, but they will never, in this world, be perfect, sinless men. We need to live in terms of the realities of this world. We cannot gain progress by striving after an impossible perfection and destroying at the same time the God-given foundations of social order. The family is basic to God's order. It is man's basic social security and responsibility in the area. How frustrating. The area of closest loyalty and strength. How dare we deny to public officials the right to rely on their most loyal supporters, their relatives, in their administration of office? Every man in office has a right to depend on his family and to help them secure employment. Instead of being morally wrong, it is morally commendable, as long as honest work is rendered for honest wages. Is it not time we dropped this extensive hostility to the family? Alrighty, folks. Thanks for listening thus far. Don't forget to like and share. And if you'd like to support this work financially to help me do more better work, you can go to nathanteacher.com and go to donations to make a donatio. Okay, let's skip on to chapter 27. Alrighty, here we are, chapter 27. The flight from life. One of the dominant aspects of modern life is escapism, not only in literature, but in all the arts. There is a rebellion against the realities of life and a systematic attempt to find refuge in a dream world. A prominent area of escape for the past century has been the academic world, the university in particular. Men who found the realities of the workday world unpleasant turned to the university as a way out. It was not scholarship they loved, but the business world which they hated. To them, the test of a working world was anathema. They were, in a sense, a new kind of hermit, running away from the civilized world and renouncing it for a new way of life. Speaking of some of these men in England, the critic Edmund Wilson spoke of them as belonging to the monastic order of English university ascetics. Their asceticism was forsaking the world of capitalism and Christianity, the world of the family and its morality, for a new order, an anti-Christian one. Everything in the old world was and is to these men evil and anathema, and they denounce it with religious intensity and passion. The basic fallacy of these men was and is their flight from reality. Now, a rebellion against the injustices and evils of this world is a healthy and necessary reaction in every generation. Progress is in part a product of discontent, an unwillingness to accept the status quo, and a desire to establish better law and order, greater justice, and a stronger sense of community. Inventions have been a product of man's restlessness with inadequate devices and the desire to improve in techniques and devices. Progress, however, comes only when men move in terms of a sense of reality, not in flight from reality. To cite a commonplace illustration, two brothers from a particularly underprivileged home both sought to escape it. One sought refuge in liquor first and then later in narcotics. The other studied at nights until he was able to qualify for a responsible and well-paying position. But history has periodically seen men in full rebellion against reality and in flight from it. They seek to conform life and reality to their dream world, to impossibilities which seem wonderful in imagination, but produce horror and destruction when forced onto reality. For a man of 75 to dream of being 21 again is foolish enough, but to attempt to play the part of a young man of 21 is insanity. It is a flight from both reality and life, because life can be lived only in terms of reality. The university is still a major form of escapism. The perpetual student who is unwilling to grow up and leave the university is a common fact today. Most universities are crowded with non-students or unweaned students who cling to the school because they are unwilling to face the hated adult world of work and responsibility. Politics, however, has become an even more important form of escapism. The political escapist hates reality, and he plans to abolish reality by means of political action. Basic to the biblical faith is individual responsibility. Man is a sinner, accountable to God, redeemable only by Jesus Christ. And the focal point of social change must be the heart of man. But because man is a sinner, he is unwilling to accept responsibility for his sin, nor is he ready to blame himself for his failures. Instead, his basic presupposition is that all is well with him and all is wrong with the world. Therefore, his every answer to his problems is to change the world, not himself. For Karl Marx, this meant revolution. Marx had a religious belief in the power of revolution to create paradise on earth. The results of the destruction of the old order would be the birth of a new order. This faith was plainly stated by the Marxists in Russia at the Second Congress of the party, August 1903. By introducing social instead of private ownership of the means of production and exchange, by introducing well-regulated organisation in the social process of production, so that the well-being and the many-sided development of all members of society may be ensured, the social revolution of the proletariat will abolish the division of society into classes and thus emancipate all oppressed humanity and will put an end to all forms of exploitation of one part of society. Of one part of society by another. It was actually believed that the revolution would abolish exploitation and class division. In actuality, it increased them. This 1903 manifesto is one of the 4 great communist manifestos. Some of the things this manifesto called for are of interest. Thus, it called for local self-government on a wide scale, home rule for all localities where the population is of special composition and characterized by special conditions of life. It also demanded inviolability of person and dwelling, unlimited freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, strikes and unions, freedom of movement and occupation. Of course, the very opposite of this is the rule in all Marxist countries. But this is not all. The manifesto called for an 8-hour workday for all hired labour, and also for the complete prohibition of overtime work, and the prohibition of night work from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. From 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. in all the branches of national economy, with the exception of those in which this is absolutely necessary because of technical considerations approved by labour organisations, prohibition of the employment of children of school age, prohibition of women's labour in all branches of industry injurious to women's health. The manifesto cited the need for a complete socialist overturn as the only way of abolishing all poverty and all exploitation. The necessary condition for this social revolution is the dictatorship of the proletariat. The revolution, according to the manifesto, would bring about a translation from barbarism, the Tsarist monarchy, to a translation. Yes, it is translation. Okay, sorry. To a democratic republic whose constitution would guarantee liberty. The reality, of course, is that the revolution which the Marxists of 1903 brought about in 1917 in Russia not only did not bring about the glorious new world they dreamed of, but created a tyranny which executed virtually every surviving framer of the 1903 Manifesto. Instead of a glorious liberty, the result was a brutal reign of terror, one which continues to this day. The root cause of the failure of the Marxist dream is that it represents a flight from reality. Marxism denies the biblical doctrine of original sin. Instead of dealing realistically with man as sinner, it holds to the neutral or even good nature of man and his perfectibility. This means that instead of distrusting man and hedging him in with checks and balances in the state, Marxism trusts power in the hands of men and creates a totalitarian state. The results of this inability to see man as he is an inability to live in terms of reality. The Marxist lacks the capacity to govern because he knows neither his own nature nor the nature of man elsewhere. He lives under the illusion that his Marxist dream represents inevitable historical truth instead of error. As a result, his mental perspective is no different than that of the insane. He regards his illusions as reality and insists on living in terms of his illusions. As a consequence, his government can produce only chaos and destruction. It is a perpetual hindrance to the very productivity it demands of the people. The Marxist state accuses the people of sabotaging the national economy when the actual saboteur is the Marxist state. This flight from reality infects more than the Marxists of our time. It infects, as we have seen, the world of the university. It also affects liberalism. It also infects liberalism, which builds also on the fallacious premise of the goodness of man. Some forms of political conservatism, because they reject Christian foundations, are guilty of the same illusion concerning man. Every failure to recognize man as a sinner, every failure to face reality as it is before we begin to deal with it constructively, is not only a flight from reality, but a flight from life. We are running away from life if we refuse to face it as it is, if we demand that life conform itself to our illusions. Dostoevsky saw clearly the implications of the radical thinkers of his day. Starting from unlimited freedom, they arrived at unlimited despotism. Mankind was divided into two unequal parts. Quote, 1/10 is to enjoy absolute freedom and unbounded power over the other 9/10. The others must give up all individuality and become something like a herd to attain, through boundless submission and by a series of regenerations, a state of primeval innocence, something like the Garden of Eden. End quote. In effect, what the advocates of this socialist world demand is the right to become gods and rule over all other men. For men to imagine themselves to be gods is a flight from reality into monstrous delusions. Dostoevsky had a radical declare, quote, everyone belongs to all and all belongs to everyone. All are slaves and equal in their slavery. Slaves are bound to be equal. Without despotism, there has never been either freedom or equality, but in the herd there is bound to be equality. The moment you have family ties or love, you have the desire for property. We will destroy that desire. We shall reduce everything to a common denominator, complete equality, complete obedience, complete loss of individuality. End quote. Dostoevsky attempted to warn man of what was coming, but men failed to heed his warning because they shared the same humanistic illusions concerning man. They refused to face the fact that of man's total depravity. They were themselves too guilty of the desire to be gods to see this urge as sin in other men. Basic to every flight from reality is a flight from creaturehood, an unwillingness to accept the fact that we are men, not gods. Satan's basic temptation and man's original sin is the attempt to be as gods, knowing or determining good and evil for ourselves. Genesis 3:5. Man was created by God to be a man, not a god, and given a glorious destiny as man under God. Man was summoned to be a king, priest, and prophet under God over the earth, but man sinned by attempting to be his own God. In Jesus Christ, man is restored to his destiny. Apart from Jesus Christ, man lives under the illusion that his sin to be as God is fact, and he attempts to make his word become flesh, that is That is, his illusion to become fact. The consequence is destruction and chaos. Every flight from reality is suicidal. It is a flight also from life. Life can be realized in its potentialities only on God's terms, not man's. Christ's words, speaking as wisdom, are still true. He that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death. Proverbs 8:36. Hockle dockle. I hope you like very much. I hope you like. Yep, that was great. That was good. Again, this was the book Law and Liberty. Excellent book, short chapters, worth reading. If you want to support this work, give me a message, give me a like, give me a share on YouTube or Facebook. And if you want to support the work financially to help me do more better work, you can go to nathanteacher.com and hit the